Okay, welcome everyone. My name's JP. I work at Weaviate in the developer relations team as an educator. So I get to do, basically sessions like this where I get to talk to all of you, hear what you get some feedback about Weaviate and what you're using it for and what cool stuff you're building. So today we're in office hours. Typically we do question and answers and so on. This session's a little bit different and quite exciting because we're going to be talking about primarily Weaviate 1.28, which has come out, I think, literally an hour ago or so, which is super, super exciting. So what you're looking at, hopefully you can see my screen, is a blog post that's actually not yet even released. So we have prepared a blog post. You can see my very hastily prepared graphics for 1.28. So we'll have a real graphics tomorrow when it goes out. But I've got a summary of the individual features for 1.28, which is why I'm showing this as an anchor. So these are the highlight kind of features that are coming out for 1.28. The biggest one that we're really excited about, and the engineers have worked quite hard on, and we're really excited about from a user perspective as well, is the role-based access control, or RBAC. So what is RBAC? Basically, it's a way to provide granular access to different users. So if you've used enterprise-grade systems, whether it's through hyperscalers or other types of database, this kind of system gives you the ability as an administrator and at an enterprise or big organizational level to give different access to different users so that they only have access to what they need. So they can get on with their job, but also you can de-risk the kind of system level risk of people having access to resources that they don't need, and risk of things going wrong, as well as, of course, any malicious use of your resources. Cool. So there's a bunch of things we can read about it, but let's make it a little bit more interesting. So what I've got is a Jupyter notebook with some notes. And hopefully we can go through the code base as well and try this out. So I've come up with a little bit of a scenario to talk about what kind of situations you might use, RBAC in. So let's say a clear one is as a system administrator, right? As a system administrator. So as a system administrator, the kind of thing you'll be doing is setting up your database and systems for different users, right? So in this particular scenario, let's say you're working for this company called Innovate or AI Innovate, and they have different products, right? So it might have a chatbot, similar to what Scott was talking about earlier, or e-commerce platform, or any number of things. So given that situation, how do you ensure that only the right people or the people you want have access to the right resources? And maybe we can go back a little bit and talk about what the available authentication and authorization systems we have in Weaviate are. And at the moment, the available systems are what we call the admin list or anonymous access, right? So if it's anonymous access, you can give everyone admin rights and everyone can do whatever they want, which is simple and easy to use. And, I use that kind of system myself if I'm doing development, but that's not what I want for production. So in production settings, you can use an admin list in Weaviate at the moment. So some users can be administrators can manipulate any resource that they want, and some users can be readers. But the shortcoming is with that situation or with that setup is that if you have these multiple collections like that, you can't give certain users access to certain resources and others different resources, right? So that's where RBAC or role-based access control comes in. And in this 1.28 release, we're releasing that as like our first iteration of it. And we're calling that a technical preview because we're really excited to share it with the developers and have them try it out and administrators as we improve it. So as the feature matures, it'll come out of the preview phase. But for now, it's a preview feature. So what kinds of things can you do with it? I can, again, go and show you some of the documentation and so on, but, it's a bit dry, right? So let's have a look at how it's implemented. So let's talk about the first place to start with RBAC, which is the system setup. So the way it's configured at the moment, and again, this is probably going to change in the future, to enable RBAC, we would go to the configuration for Weaviate and enable it through certain flags. So if you've used Weaviate with the self-deployed settings, you would have probably used it through Docker. It could be through Kubernetes. But in the Docker compose file, you can set a bunch of environment or any number of environment variables. So these environment variables are what you'd want to set up for authentication and authorization. From 1.28, we get these exciting set of RBAC environment variables, right? So this one says, oh, this is how you enable RBAC. So I've set that to true. And I can also have associated associated variables for admin users and viewer users, which is new. So let's go through exactly what's going on here. So the first thing I've done in the top line, or in this section on line 28, is that I've disabled anonymous access, right? So, it's simple enough to do. And what I've done is to enable API key-based authentication. So you can log into Weaviate using an API key. What the next two lines do is that they define a set of keys for logging in with, right? So it's this line of allowed keys and users. So the corresponding set of users. So in this configuration, I've got a bunch of keys here. I think 6 keys or 5, and 5 users that's correspondingly configured. So if you log in with an API key called viewer key, you'd be authenticated as viewer user. So Weaviate says, okay, so this key corresponds to this user. So I know that that's what they are. And then the next step is the authorization step. So Weaviate knows who you are. And it goes, okay, what rights should a viewer user have? So here in the authorization viewer users key, you can see just the one person or one user is defined, and that's the viewer user. Simple enough. And in the same way, if you log in with the system admin key, you are authenticated as the system admin user. And we have defined this person as an admin user. So they get all the rights associated, or permissions, I should say, associated with that user. But you also see all these other users and keys, right? So you got all these keys called recipe admin, recipe editor, and so on, and the corresponding users here. And you'll notice I've not defined any additional roles or any other sets of permissions here, right? So that's where RBAC comes in terms of us being able to provide or configure and assign these custom permissions to users. So again, just to recap, what we need to do to use RBAC is to configure these settings in the environment variables or in the Helm charts for Kubernetes. And then once you've done that, once you've enabled RBAC and set up at least one admin user so you can do super user things, you can start to assign custom roles and permissions to these users. Cool. So once that's done, now we can start to define and assign roles. Now, obviously, we want to be a system. So we want to be logged in as a user that has rights to change users' roles and permissions and so on. So what do we do here? Well, let's log in as our admin user that we've defined. We know that the key that we want to use is this one, system admin key. And obviously, this can be any text we want that we defined. So we'll do that. So we're logging into Weaviate with this admin key, and that identifies us to Weaviate as our system admin user. I'm just going to now clean up some of this stuff that's already in the database. I've been playing with it. So don't worry too much about this, but you can see I'm deleting certain roles. So basically, so I can recreate them later in this demo. And I'm just going to create some. I'm going to restart this notebook. Excuse me. And then I'm going to delete this collection called recipe, just so we can recreate that again. I hope that's clear so far. And then the next thing I'm going to do now is to define sets of permissions. We, in the recent past, have updated our Python client. So thanks for the thumbs up, Scott. Appreciate it. Create helper functions and classes so we can get IDE help. So we can do the same thing here. So it's Weaviate classes is the namespace where we want to. What I'm going to do is look in the classes namespace, and there's all these sub namespaces in there. For RBAC, we're going to get a new one called RBAC, which is very nice. And I'm going to import permissions. That's interesting that I'm not getting. Okay, there we go. Permissions. So once I do that, I can now use this permissions class to define our permissions. So what we'll first do is define an admin role that can basically manipulate anything to do with a recipes collection for our recipe based AI bot, right, or chatbot. Let's call that recipe admin permissions. And then what it's going to be is in Python, a list of things. Whoa, that's not correct, Copilot. Thank you. So what I want to do is define a certain number of things. So one is a set of collection permissions. And so I can create, read, update, delete permissions. So collections. And so our name, sorry. And then I can just navigate through the available parameters and say, well, do I want to be able to create them? Yes. What about read? Yes. Do I want to be able to read the collection? So CRUD, let's do update in the order of CRUD and delete. So now this will confer permissions to be able to basically perform all CRUD, create, read, update, delete operations on collections. We've separated out collections for dealing with collection metadata, as in defining a collection and reading how it's configured, to be able to actually deal with the data objects in that collection. So that'll be a different permission. So I need to give our admin person that permission. So that'll be data. The collection name would still be the same, recipe. And I can go through the same number of steps and say create, true, read, update, true, delete, true. So it when you first see it, this will seem kind of long, but you can also see that since I can autocomplete using the ID, what's it called, IntelliSense, it doesn't actually take me that long. So I've defined these permissions. I can now start to assign them to roles as I go. So let's have a look at how to do that. So I can go. So if I look in the roles namespace, I get all of these different methods. So what I'm doing at the first instance is I'm going to create a role, and the role name, is should be recipe admin. And by default, the role doesn't say anything about, or the Weaviate doesn't know anything about what permissions this role should have, right? So the permissions should be, I'm going to turn Copilot off. The permissions should be our recipes admin permissions that we've just defined above. So if I do that, what I've now got is a new role called HiDuda, recipes admin. Once I've done that, now I can assign this role to users. Roles, and then the method names are self-explanatory. So I want to assign that role to this user. what are the parameters? Role names is recipe admin. Who are the users that I want to give it to? User is our, I can't remember the name actually. So recipe admin user is the user that I want to assign it to. Cool. So I've done that. And what that means is now the user, once they connect to Weaviate with this identity, they'll have all the permissions that we've defined up here. So let's give that a go and then see what that looks like. I'm going to just copy paste this code because I'm lazy. And once I do that, I'm also going to copy paste my key because I don't remember. So that's the recipe admin key. So what I'm going to do is, let's call that recipe admin client. So now, anytime I use the recipe admin client object, I'm going to be interacting with Weaviate with the identity of recipe admin user. So the only thing that I can do would be what I've given here. Just to demonstrate that concept, that hopefully this works. Let's have a look and say roles. Let's do list all. No, that's not what I chose. List all. Cool. There we go. So if I use this recipe admin client and I want to ask Weaviate to list all the roles that exist in the system, I now get Weaviate. Well, the Weaviate throws an error, which Python interprets as an insufficient permissions error here. But the message is basically, the reason is that my user, so you can see Weaviate's correctly identified me as recipe admin user, has insufficient permissions to perform this action, right? So even if you've used RBAC before, hopefully this concept is relatively clear. If you've not, hopefully the idea though of, hey, these are the things, there are things I can ask my database to do, and certain actions are associated with resources. And if I'm not allowed to do a thing, I will get this kind of error. Like intuitively, hopefully that makes sense. But I have permissions to say, read a collection, right? I can read a collection called recipe. I can create a collection called recipe. So I should be able to do that. So I'm going to just collapse that for now. And actually, what I can do is if I show you that if I use the admin client, I can now do that without throwing an error, right? So again, this admin client, not recipe admin client, is the one that we instantiate up the top with the full pre-defined admin user sets of privileges. So now if I list all the roles with this, I can see them. So what that means is now I can actually, I'm just going to copy and paste this code so you don't have to watch me type. But if I do it this way, I'm going to try and create, using the recipe admin client, a collection called recipe. And the details don't really matter here. But the point is, if I do that, it works without any errors. And now I can see whether this, sorry, I get confused when tooltips cover my screen. So I can inspect this collection. Pretty simple, right? So that's sort of an idea of giving admin privileges. Let's do a couple of examples where I provide different sets of permissions, excuse me. So let's do one where we have an editor. And what that would mean is maybe we won't be able to say create a collection or delete a collection, but maybe you want them to be able to read a collection so that they can see that one exists and what the configuration or the data schema, for example, would look like. And for things like data, let's say they can do all the CRUD. So that's an editor. And let's do another one of a viewer. And for this person, they won't be able to see the collection config at all. And all they will be able to do is to read the collection data. So we'll do that. And CV. So what we'll also do is to now create corresponding roles, right? So I'll create an editor role and then create a viewer role. Make sure I use the right variables here. Editor should be correct. Cool. So now I've got a new role called recipe editor, another role called recipe viewer. And now I can now assign these roles to our users. So I can say recipe editor, and that would be an editor user, and that would be a viewer. Cool. Now I should have additional users, additional rights conferred to the viewer user and editor user, which you saw us define earlier. So to see again what we can do with these users, we want to authenticate against Weaviate with those permissions, right? So let's create new client objects. So this will be an editor. Oops, I want to copy all these lines. I think that should be correct. Oh, that should be viewer client. Cool. So now I've got four client objects. Actually, I've got the admin client with our kind of super user rights. I've got a regular admin client, editor client, viewer client. And based on which client that I use, Weaviate will identify me as a different user identity. And therefore, I'll have different rights. So again, going back to our simple example, this worked. And when I list all the roles, you can see now there's more of them, right? Because I've created all these roles just above. But again, if I do things like, hey, can I list all these roles as the viewer, recipe viewer, excuse me? Can I do that? Well, no, because I'm not allowed to do so, which is, to be expected. So we created our collection earlier, but excuse me. And I'm just trying to copy and paste this code. It's very difficult. Delete. Let's just delete the collection for a time being. So you can see that admin client lets me delete a collection. And again, it lets me create it. But if I delete it once again, and if I use an editor client, this fails. So, again, same concept. Now it's not able to create a collection, although we're able to delete it. So you need the right level of permissions to be able to do all of those things. And this granularity in permission sets, I won't go through maybe all of different steps because hopefully you get the high level idea of what's available. But all of these granularity of permissions propagate to different domains. So in this action here, we've created a collection. But if I want to create data objects, so if I want to actually create some recipes, I can try and do that here. So let's define some, simple recipes here. And in the case of our client, if I want to batch import data, this object that I'm interacting with needs to have data creation rights to be able to do that. And depending on whether I'm updating the data, you can get different permissions as well. So again, this would work just fine, but not always. Just one caveat as we do this. So now if I get a viewer client and go, recipes, collections, get recipe. Let's do it on a different line. So if I want to interact with our recipes collection, I can do things like Where is, oops, that's a query. Fetch objects. So if I want to, well, that's interesting. Why did I not give it the ability to read collections? Okay. Let's try the editor client. I must have messed something up here. Apologies. Okay, cool. So that worked. I can view the data objects within the recipes that we just created, right? So we're getting some data objects back, and you can see here the recipe for, I want to say, scrambled eggs, something like that. There's a caveat at the moment with RBAC. So, bit of a preview. So if I wasn't using an admin client, I can get the object count of all the objects by just doing that, like using the built-in Python built-in length function with recipes. Currently, this doesn't work. And this is like an implementation detail that you don't necessarily need to worry about the why so much, but it's related to a Weaviate not necessarily having. Sorry, it's related to the way GraphQL works and the fact that in Python, these aggregate queries work with GraphQL. So you don't need to worry about the details at the moment, unless you probably do that, in which case you probably do want to know that this is a thing. Um, but the if you do want to use these aggregate queries, what you'll want to do is to define an additional permission. And this is kind of relevant for a couple of reasons. So I'll say read. So what you would want to do is to have permissions for collections, where you want to be able to read all collections by name. And this is an interesting thing to show because earlier on we showed you how to manipulate just a collection with a very specific name. These cards also work in the syntax. So now this applies to any collection with any name. And what you want is something with this read config true for all collections. Now, once I have that, I can go back to my admin client, roles, and I can say add permissions. And what I can do is let's add that to our editor role for the recipe editor. Just by the way, I only figured out, I only learned about this like half an hour ago. So if I do get this wrong, please do excuse me. So what I'm doing here is adding permissions to this role. So this is the role set that we've defined just above. We already have this role, right? So once I do this, interesting. That might be a bug. Okay, so let's do it in a different way. I'll just copy and paste all of these roles. I'm going to say roles, create. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new update our user. The role names would be this recipe editor new. And what was our username? What was our username? Admissions should be here. Oh yeah, recipe editor user. Let's hope that works. So now, if I try and do something with this recipe editor user, that should now work. Let's give that a go. Okay, fingers crossed. So that now does work with this editor client. That's exciting that it worked because I actually hadn't tried that before this demo. So what I was trying to demonstrate there, a little bit clumsily, is that roles are additive. So we already had this recipe editor user to whom we've given some roles, a role before, right? And I've additionally assigned this new recipe editor role, and those two just combined together. So now this person now has these additional roles and they can do additional things. So as you might imagine, there's lots of different things you can do in terms of roles. So you can add permissions, you can create roles, delete roles, you can list all these roles. And as you go, if you decide that, this user no longer needs these sets of permissions, you can revoke certain roles, right? So it'll be good to define these roles as subsets so you can granularly define them. So it definitely gives you a lot more flexibility as a system administrator when you run Weaviate. And of course, with great power, there's great responsibilities and more overhead to some extent, where now it might be worth thinking about, well, what roles do I want to define? And how do I want to frame that? So if I want to remove certain roles or permission from certain sets of users, I can do it in a sensible way, so I don't have to granularly remove individual permissions, right? So it'd be good to have sets of permissions for certain sets of collections as editors, admin, viewers, and so on. So that's RBAC. I won't go on too much longer because I feel like I've already gone on for too long. So in our blog post that'll be live tomorrow, this is what you'll see. You'll see warnings like this in a few places. So it is being released as a technical preview. And what that means is we may still introduce additional breaking changes. But we did want to share it with the community, with you to, get you sort of to see it and then to try it out and get feedback in terms of, this is great, but hey, it'd be good if, for our organization's needs, it'd be really good if you shaped it this way, or if you had more, for example, predefined roles like X, Y, Z, or maybe we can change the interface like so, or so on. I'm not able to definitely say when we're adding certain features to this, but this is a very important feature for us, and you'll see us working on it. By 1.29, this is going to be significantly improved with additional features and so on. But the blog has more explanations, of course, on some user scenarios, how it works with authentication and authorization and RBAC, and of course, links to our documentation. So our docs have been significantly updated for these reasons, or for RBAC, as we do every release. So our authentication page now talks about the different authentication schemes, but we've improved the docs quite a bit. But now authorization, which is where, of course, you get the different rights as your identified user, talks a lot about how RBAC works as an option. So there's documentation there about built-in roles and so on. And in the third page, which is our RBAC, brand new RBAC roles page, we have a ton of code examples about or explanations of what those roles are, what permissions are possible. So, deal with roles, collections, data objects, and so on. But a ton of code examples here on how to work with these permissions, roles, and so on. So you can see on the nav bar on the right-hand side, there's a bunch of headings, and each of those are standalone code examples, so you can try them out yourself. At the moment, what you'll see are just the Python code examples, because that's at the very moment the only client library with RBAC support natively, but the others will be coming very, very soon. So that's all on RBAC for now. If you have any questions, by the way, just feel free to either unmute yourself and just ask, or you can dump it into the chat box, and I'll keep an eye on that as well. Cool. So that's RBAC. Let's have a look at a couple of other things that are very exciting. Actually, next one I'll just talk about very briefly. So another one is our async indexing. We introduced async indexing in 1.22. What it is that for vector databases like Weaviate, we have multiple types of indexes. Just as very brief background, indexes help you to organize your information in anything, in particular things like databases where you have lots of information and you want to search through it very, very quickly. Being a vector database, we have a thing called a vector index. Typically, that's fairly, it's a data structure that helps you look through these complex sets of numbers, which are vectors. And, I'm obviously abstracting over a lot of the complexity here, but the bottom line is that these can be fairly complex in order to help us search through our data fast. And that means it can be a bottleneck in certain situations, like when you import lots of data. So what async indexing does is to decouple all of that operation from when you're doing things like large-scale imports, right? So if you're importing 100 million objects, as you go, Weaviate just builds a queue of objects to add to the vector index while it imports the data. So that means, as a user, once you're done sending those 100 million objects and it's added to data store, you get a response saying, okay, cool, we're done with the operation. You can get on with whatever else you want to do. And the whole time, Weaviate remains operational. And in the meantime, Weaviate's building the vector index so that for all the indexed data, search is still very fast. It just lags behind a little bit between the object store and the vector index. So that's what an async index is in a couple of minutes. What we've done for this release is again, a lot of the under the hood cool stuff, but there's two really big things to highlight. One is that now all operations, not just batch imports, go through the async index async index. So before it used to be that only certain operations went through this async index, and that meant a little bit of overhead in terms of which operations had access to the index called a lock. And there was a little bit of, could be a small bottleneck. So this improves performance in that respect. The second part is, again, under the hood, the queue structure was in memory and now it's on disk. So what that means is, as a user, you'll see slightly higher disk usage in Weaviate and slightly lower memory usage. They're not huge, so you probably won't notice them one way or the other, but it is probably going to be an improvement because, memory tends to be more expensive than storage. So that's what's happening. So if to enable it, it's still an experimental feature that we're evaluating, and of course, as you see, improving. So in your environment variable, you can turn it on by setting this value to true. I believe on Weaviate Cloud, you can enable it with a toggle on the beautiful interface that we have over there, which is really cool. Couple other things. So one is conflict resolution, or more specifically to do with deletes. This is most relevant if you have a multi-node cluster, right? Like if you have a Weaviate setup with probably 3 or plus nodes, and you have data replicated across these nodes. So, of course, then you need to have consistency across all these nodes. And one challenge with that is to do with deletion, right? So how does your database know whether when you don't have an object on one node, whether has it been deleted or is it yet to be created, right? So this is one area where we've provided more options as to, well, in those situations, how do they get resolved? And it introduces these options at the configuration level. So as a user, it's all fairly simple to implement. Do I not have the code example to do it? That's fine. I'll just quickly do that. So when you create a collection, so let's say admin client, collections, create some collection, and you'll have a bunch of other settings. But what you'll have is this thing called replication. One parameter that you have in this method is a parameter called replication config. To do that, you can go to the configure class and go replication. And one of the parameters now that you'll see is this deletion strategy. And you might go, okay, well, how do I know which deletion strategies are available? Well, I would say from Weaviate classes, config, import, can I import a class? Turns out you can. So you can import this, which is an enum. So if I now copy and paste that name and press dot, I get the 3 available options. So all you need to do is just choose one of them. And I didn't really remember, as you saw me type away, I was just I had an idea of what I was searching for. So I knew that there was something to do with deletion is one of my parameters. I knew there was some sort of a class here to import to do with deletion. And once I import that, I get the options of, delete on conflict or time-based resolution or so on. So that's all you need to do to have your Weaviate cluster configured and on how to manage those conflicts. You can see this is also not a system-wide Weaviate setting. This is configurable per collection. So depending on whatever your needs might be, you can resolve your conflicts this way. So in many cases, I think time-based resolution might be a good way to go, but it really might depend a little bit on your very specific needs. But yeah, that's a pretty cool thing to do to have as a for system robustness and so on. Okay, let's talk very quickly about the Japanese tokenizer. I'm not sure how many of you would speak Japanese in the crowd, but my Japanese is pretty terrible too, despite having done 2 years of that at university. And this is a tokenizer in the context of BM25 tokenizer, not necessarily tokenizer in the sense of large language models and embeddings tokenization. So for BM25 searches and filters, the system needs to know, hey, how do I break up the long pieces of text like this for searching? And that's called tokenization. And the options we have typically are based on, word boundaries like spaces and so on. And it doesn't translate all that well to languages like Japanese or Korean and so on. So this is a pretty cool feature because one of our community users, Mr. Tani, has contributed this feature to Weaviate. So what he's done is added this thing called the Kagome tokenizer for Japanese. And to use it, you just need to set an in-app environment variable to true. And at the collection definition level, so you would just define that in the set of properties and property. So in this settings, one of the options here is tokenization. And then again, how do I know what options do I have? I import the tokenization class. and it's an enum, so now you use the Kagome JA for standard language code tokenization enum. So that's all you need to do. So if you are dealing with Japanese text, this will help Weaviate identify proper word boundaries, break up your text into sensible sets of words or tokens, so you can do your keyword searches and your filtering in a sensible manner, which is really, really cool. And I think it's really cool that we have a community user who came and helped us out by contributing this to our code base. So thank you very much, Mr. Otani. Okay, a couple other ones before we go. One is BlockMax WAND. Andre, who worked on this, would highlight that this is a very early stage, like really exciting review, but definitely don't use this in production is one thing Andre would highlight. A BlockMax WAND, or BMW as it's very catchily called as an acronym, is a way of indexing your data, again, for keyword searches. And at a very high level, my understanding is that it organizes your data into blocks, and it pre-calculates a lot of the statistics that you need for BM25 searching using those blocks, right? So it means you can do fewer searches because you can, out of hand, reject more of these blocks of data. So that's like my very high level understanding of this stuff. I'll have to do a little bit more reading. But again, from a user perspective, if you're really keen to try it out, we'd of course welcome and encourage you. And this is how you would do it, is by setting these environment variables. But the strong caveat with this is that at the moment, the usage of this feature requires you to re-ingest all of your data, right? And in the future, when this becomes a mature feature, you will likely have to re-ingest your data for that time. So that's why we really strongly encourage you to, we welcome you trying it out. But if I would heavily caveat that by saying that if you try it out now, you will need to perform fairly heavy migration work in the future. So definitely, if you're interested, try it out in an experimental setting and compare them and see if it might work for you, especially if BM25 searches are important to you. But definitely not for production. Cool. Just a couple more small, well, pretty big things actually, but slightly only adjacent to 1.28. One is multimodal model support for our friends at Voyage AI. Also wanted to give them a shout out because they helped us implement this integration into Weaviate as well. So thank you very much to the team. But what we've done, what this integration does is to enable Voyage AI's new multimodal model, which is called Voyage Multimodal 3, into Weaviate. And that means with just a few lines of code in Weaviate, you can vectorize your text and image data using this model. And you would do that in the collection definition to say, for example, vectorizer config would be configure vectorizer, and we have all these different models, integrations available. And the client support's not there yet, but it'll be up soon. So it'll be added as another really exciting option to things like the Cohere multimodal model. So it's a really cool model. I know I'm excited. I think obviously the team at Voyage are very excited about this model. So that's going to be really, really cool. So there's a little note here saying the client support and official docs will follow very soon, because that from a user in the next few days, probably. As a user, you can't use it just yet. The next and the last thing for this session is Weaviate embeddings. We've introduced a service called Weaviate embeddings in the last week or so. And what it is a embeddings generation service, and at the moment just for text data. But this is really cool because you don't necessarily have to provide an additional API key on top of your Weaviate API key to use an embeddings service provider. Sorry, I dropped something. Embeddings service provider. So this is for Weaviate Cloud users only. And if you're a Weaviate Cloud user, you can enable this service, conveniently generate vector embeddings for your data, just with the simple provision of your Weaviate key. So we have a documentation here on the Weaviate developers, cloud, and embeddings. So you can check that out, and there's model documentation for that. So that's it from me.